Welcome everyone to this book talk about J.S.Sarreal's wonderful new publication with University of California Press. And I want to say it's my great pleasure to introduce J.S.Sarreal, whose work I'm a huge fan of, and I teach it in a bunch of my food-related courses. Her first book was The Guarani and Their Missions, a socioeconomic history, and it treated the early history of mate production, which became vital to Jesuit missionization and quite lucrative for those missions, which is called Yerba Mate, the Drink That Shaped a Nation, which is just out with the University of California Press. So congratulations to her for that. Her undergraduate degree was in economics, which helps explain her ability to deftly weave economic history into social and political history in ways that many commodity histories and historians do not always do. She's associate professor at Arizona State University. Yerba Mate, The Drink That Shaped a Nation, is a fabulous book that is so wide-ranging. It encompasses economic history as well as the cultural significance of this bitter drink with a very long history that extends deeply into the pre-colonial period, and of course is one of the important indigenous commodities of Latin America originally. So it's really both a very rich commodity history as well as a cultural history of this evergreen plant related to the holly. So it's really an exhaustive account of mate and its labor, social, political, economic, and cultural history. And I will also say that this is also a topic that is special to me because when my twins were born, we had an Argentine nanny for whom the kitchen became walking into Buenos Aires for 10 years. So I have a special relationship to mate as Julia does as well. So we're going to do Q&A, and so how should we both stand here?
You're doing Q&A style right now from the beginning?
Yeah.
Sure, that works.
Okay, perfect.
Or if you're sitting out here, Robin, people can also see you via that camera up there.
Okay, perfect.
Cameras, so that works as well.
Good. We don't have to give up our mate. Yeah.
All right, so well then,
Do I?
we should probably have one person at the.
All right. Okay, perfect. Good. That's weird. Here's a one right there. Oh, there. Yeah, perfect.
I want to say, first of all, I am so thrilled to be here. I am a historian. I study Yerba Mate, but it's really fun to come to a room full of people like this, people who are interested in Yerba Mate, share my research and my interest in this book. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Well, maybe we can start with Julia, you telling us about how you became interested in mate and how the idea for this book developed.
Yeah. So I have a couple of slides here. Oh, how do I?
I'm getting going for you right now.
Sorry. Okay. So my first exposure to Yerba Mate was when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Paraguay, and that was in 1998 to 2000. And
I don't know what just happened there. Let me keep going.
okay,
Yeah, keep going. We're good.
Oh, I'm trying to move it. Is it a slide? Or wagging it?
I'll move.
Okay. So I have I think 4 slides here.
Sorry, guys. It's gonna be a good set.
It's always a challenge, the technology.
Yeah. Have any of you thought about doing the Peace Corps? Anybody who is a student? No? So I first learned about Yerba Mate in the Peace Corps. I can show some slides in a little bit. And I drank it as a Peace Corps volunteer. You had to drink Yerba Mate to have conversations, to be part of the community. And that was when I was first exposed to it. And then oh good, we're in the slides. Oops. So here are some,
There you go.
Okay, so these are pictures. The top ones were when I was, all these are from Peace Corps. but I learned how yerba mate was produced, was harvested. This is a structure, a barbacoa, that's made entirely of forest products. And that's used for toasting the yerba mate, and it dates back to the colonial period and was still being used. And then we see here the round of the mate. So some of you are familiar with Guayaquil and the healthy energy drink. In South America, it's drunk as today with cold water, and mate as hot water with hot water. A number of you who got here early have samples of mate. I encourage you to continue drinking it and just refilling it with the hot water from the thermos. Mate is not only a caffeinated beverage, it is also a social practice. So typically we would share it. So for like 5 of you would be drinking it and sharing and drinking from the same bombilla. You'd have one server who keeps refilling it with water, and throughout the whole time of my talk, you would just keep drinking it. And if we were having conversations, you would just have a long conversation like down here. It was a very endearing practice. Then I went to do my dissertation research in Buenos Aires, and I was astounded to find mate was everywhere. This is the archive, and people, the students, especially in the National Archive, they go to this is the National Library. They go to study, and they bring their mate to study. And then if there's a sign here is don't throw your yerba in the toilet. So it's everywhere. The supermarkets have more shelves of yerba mate than they do of coffee. And yet there is the stereotype, and it's very true, that there's a cafe on every corner in Buenos Aires, and they date back to the 19th century. This is Cafe Tortoni. So I was really astounded. How does mate coexist with cafes and cafe culture? You can't be drinking both. They're both highly caffeinated, so you're not drinking both of them. And the cafes never sold yerba mate, never sold mate or even yerba mate tea. So what was going on? I was very perplexed by that. So that's how I got into this book.
So can you tell us something about your journey researching this book, since you carved this story out of such a vast array of sources, from literature to essays, to theater, to travel accounts, tax registries, newspapers, and advertisements?
So I was really fortunate because I had gotten my first book done. I had tenure. I'm at Arizona State. I could do whatever I wanted for the most part. I wasn't going to get fired by not producing my book. And so there's a lot of intellectual freedom then. I had a sabbatical. I had a year in Buenos Aires, and I just decided I want to study yerba mate. I started going to every ministry, government ministry, every archive, every different place to look for what do you have about yerba mate. So, for example, in the congressional archives, I found huge debates in 1920s about yerba mate, and then 1920s, 1930s, and then nothing more. I found a whole bunch of cartoons in the 1980s, and so I would follow the different places where I found yerba mate. It was not the most efficient way to do research, but it was fun.
Mate did eventually make its way to Europe, but it took a long time to become commercially successful, unlike tea, coffee, and chocolate. Can you explain why?
It's a fascinating question because yerba mate is caffeinated, it's addictive, it's enjoyable. Coffee has the same bitter taste like mate, so it's an acquired taste. Why didn't it spread? Tobacco, chocolate came to Europe. Then we also had tea and coffee. Why didn't yerba mate spread in Europe, and it spread in South America? So this, on the left, you see the region where it grows and where it's still being produced commercially. It's border region of Paraguay, Argentina, and Brazil. And the answer is the trade routes and the Spanish Empire. So for much of the colonial period, there was the fleet system, and we're producing yerba mate in here. to get legally to Europe, you had to get down to Buenos Aires you have to cross the Andes. You had to get to Lima. You had to then go by boat to Panama, cross the isthmus, then meet up with the fleet in the Caribbean and get to Europe. It was too expensive. Silver was getting there. Chocolate and tobacco were coming from the Caribbean. It's much closer. So it couldn't shoulder the expense of the transportation. Then we have 1778, we have Comercio Libre. You can trade directly from Buenos Aires to Spain, but by then tea and coffee are in Europe. And there's a lot of anecdotal stories about British tea interests that they are trying to keep out yerba mate. It's very interesting. There's another ilex, another holly that's drinkable that's in the southern part of the United States. It is called yapon, and they named it, the scientific name is Ilex vomitorio. And the anecdotal stories about that is, why would it be called Ilex vomitorio? Nobody wants to drink it, is because they didn't want the competition for tea. So that's really the story about the early modern period.
Interesting. The history of mate contrasts strongly with the history of many tropical agricultural commodities such as sugar, which relied upon plantation agriculture, and like cacao, mate seems to prefer intercropping and puriculture and resisted cultivation for a long time. Can you tell us about mate production, why it was described as a mine by the Spanish, and why its cultivation was resisted for so long?
Yeah, so this is really unique. Until the 20th century, with the exception of the Jesuits, which I can talk to as to why, all of the yerba mate was harvested from wild yerbales. And it was not cultivated in plantations or small farms, very different than coca, than tobacco, chocolate, all of those. And because it was harvested in the wild, Spain, and then later the independent republics, considered it a mine, because you didn't have to cultivate it. It came from the earth, it came natural. And because it's a mine, you can tax it a lot, but also, or a mineral, you can, the crown maintained ownership. So you didn't have private ownership of these wild yerbales. What happens when you don't have a private ownership? You don't have, there's no incentive also to cultivate. Because you can't protect your yerbales. So not until the 20th century did they start to cultivate it. And that's really when Argentina starts to get into the picture. They start to do the cultivation. And that's when you start to have the private yerbales.
So mate, like cochineal, the dye that was developed in Guatemala, was long a very important indigenous product, which fueled resistance to colonial oppression on many occasions. Could you tell us something about that?
Yeah. So this is a substance that was discovered by indigenous peoples. The Guarani or the Caingang, I argue. Caingang are Jay-speaking people, more from Brazil. The Guarani from Paraguay, and they're the ones that discover it. But it is quickly adopted by Spaniards and mestizos, and they hire indigenous laborers to do a lot of the labor. There are various instances where the indigenous people do protest and do. It was a very oppressive system, the labor structure. So there's a great letter by Guarani who lived in the missions, protesting the act of sending their people to work in the yerbales, and about how difficult that is, how dangerous it is. It takes them periods of time away from their home. And the missions then also, for other reasons, the Jesuits started cultivating yerbales. They said to protect the Indians from the difficult harvesting in the wild, but also the Jesuits would have more oversight if the yerbales were closer to the missions and closer for them to observe. And then we also have in the 19th century, indigenous peoples in the borderlands region keeping out harvesters, that they're finding ways to make it dangerous for people to go and harvest yerba in their territories. But overall, this was a system that was exploitative for indigenous peoples. There's some protest, there's some areas and some ability to protest this, but overall it was very exploitative.
Could you tell us something about the frontier region where mate took root and how its location also figured in the history of mate production?
Yeah, we see the borderlands region where it's produced and where it grew naturally. And this was really important, this frontier area. It was a region that and is still very a lot of it's a borderlands. There's people coming back and forth. Also, largely indigenous. And so one of the points is that for a long period of time in Argentine history, this is a borderlands that's ignored, that's distant, that's more connected to Paraguay and associated with Paraguay and Brazil. And so it really inhibits the development of yerba for a long period of time. And it's always, even into the 20th century, Misiones, where it's produced in Argentina, it's this exotic land of the Guarani, of the missions, Iguazu, these big falls. But it's something that they, especially in Buenos Aires, don't really understand. It's the selva. Very exotic.
Aimé Bonpland, who is the famous German explorer Alexander von Humboldt's sidekick, saw great potential in mate, a product which had been exceedingly profitable to the Jesuit missions of Paraguay during the colonial period. Why did mate have to wait so long for its green bonanza?
Yeah, it's crazy because it was so successful. There was so much trade in yerba mate in the colonial period. Even into the 19th century, there's a lot of trade in the region. And one would think that Argentina especially would be wanting to advance this. But it's, again, this borderlands, and Argentina takes a long time to figure out the formation of the nation, there's a lot of fighting between Buenos Aires, the capital city, and the provinces. And so that really absorbs the nation. And also, there's this underlying desire to be more European. And there's a lot of talk about wheat and livestock being noble and being noble crops, the focus on the pampas. And Misiones, this is associated with earlier on with indigenous, but then also with the gauchos. And it's not the model that especially a lot of the elite want to promote.
One of the very interesting threads in this account is the complex history of how mate started as an indigenous product, later becoming associated with the figure of the backwoods itinerant gaucho, and eventually becoming a symbol of Argentine nationhood. Can you sketch the contours of this trajectory and what contributed to the eventual emergence of what might be termed mate nationalism?
Yeah. So in my introduction, I delve into the name Yerba Mate. And this really is, as an economic historian, really took me in a different direction, is to really explore the name. I never thought about names before. But yerba is herb. It's not an herb, it's a tree. And mate is an indigenous term, but it's not Guarani and it's not Kaingang. And so we see, I think that looking at the name is a great way to think about and understand mate, yerba mate, the conquest, and the erasure and reappropriation of indigenous history, indigenous culture. I think I have it. See, does this? It's not a problem. Where should I aim it?
What?
The.
I don't know if it has it. Does it have a name or not?
I don't know.
Oh, you want to try again?
Okay.
Well, not.
No.
There we go.
Oops, now I'm going way ahead.
Suddenly it starts working again.
Okay, there we go.
Separated
So this is Ilex paraguayensis. It's a holly, and it's a tree. So it's not an herb. The original indigenous names are Ka'a, which is pretty widely known. But it's also Kongoy, which has often been forgotten. Kongoy is a Kaingang term. And in Brazil, Congonhas is an airport in Sao Paulo. There's a cultural site in Minas Gerais called Congonhas. But when I've spoken to Brazilians, they do not associate that with Yerba Mate. But Congonha is a Kaingang term for Yerba Mate. It's been forgotten largely. Not only that, in the beginning of the 20th century, the Spanish translation, which is Congonilla, was used widely in the press in Argentina for adulterated, false yerba. So going back, Congoy, the indigenous term, becomes a word for fake adulterated yerba. Continuing on with the naming, in the colonial period, it was not called yerba mate, it was called yerba del Paraguay, associating it with the geographic origins, but again, not the people. It was often associated with the Jesuits, in fact. It only became yerba mate when Argentina started producing cultivated yerba. Then they no longer wanted it to be called yerba del Paraguay for national reasons, and it became this yerba mate. So that shows even today in Argentina, especially, and I think also in Uruguay, it's much more associated with the gaucho than with indigenous peoples. In here, I think Guayaquil, we see the association with indigenous peoples, but in South America, you don't see that as much. The gaucho is a symbol of Argentina, a symbol of Criollo culture of being native born. It's associated with a cowboy, and you can see a cowboy in the bottom having this gaucho having mate. But Sarmiento, an important thinker of the time, he became president. He wrote Facundo, Civilization and Barbarity, and he did not look at the gaucho as a wonderful symbol of Argentine identity. The gaucho was someone that should be eliminated, and civilization, Europe, was what was important. And so this Yerba Mate got taken along with this, the idea of the gaucho and kind of the backwardness. So there was a divide with Yerba Mate. People still drank a lot of mate. There's this really conflict between people are widely drinking it, but yet it's also associated with barbarity. And we see in much of the 20th century, actually, per capita consumption in Argentina declines, and only in the past 2 decades or so, it's become a national symbol. And it's the national infusion, and there's Yerba Mate Argentina as a geographic indication.
Interesting. So you mentioned this adulterated. What can you say a little bit about how was mate getting adulterated?
Yeah, so the colonial era, all the yerba is coming from Paraguay. There's conflict between Paraguay in the post colonial period after independence. There's a lot of conflict between Paraguay and Argentina and Buenos Aires. Paraguay was part of the Rio de la Plata viceroyalty. Buenos Aires, Argentina, always thought Paraguay should continue to be part of its nation. So there was a lot of conflict between Paraguay and especially Buenos Aires, and Rosas and other presidents. They could cut off trade to Paraguay. Paraguay is landlocked, and there's the river is the main route of trade. And so Rosas is not happy with Paraguay. They cut off trade. And so there's not a lot of the yerba mate. There was a lot of restrictions on the yerba coming out of Paraguay. Brazil jumps in. Brazil then becomes the major producer. Brazil, there's Ilex paraguayensis is what is officially yerba mate. You cannot call something yerba mate legally today unless it's Ilex paraguayensis. But there are many different ilexes. And there were many variations of yerba mate in the colonial period and even into the 19th century. And Brazil was known for selling other elixirs and also adding other, well, that, from the Argentine perspective, that they're adding other things to their elix to make it just and selling it as yerba mate. And so Argentina trying to enter into production and sell its cultivated yerba, they're competing with Brazil. And so they call Brazilian yerba adulterated in order to compete with the Brazilian, which is cheaper. The Brazilian yerba is cheaper.
Oh, interesting. Mate runs parallel to another important originally indigenous product, the drinking chocolate of Mexico. Since it was used as an item of tribute, it was used as a currency. It was deployed in shamanistic rites, and its form of consumption is highly ritualized. Marcy Norton has argued that as the Spanish adopted cacao techniques such as frothing, it in effect indigenized the Spanish. Could we say the same of how mate may have perhaps indigenized Argentine elites?
Oh yeah, totally. As we see the drinking, the paraphernalia for yerba mate is very strange, very different. And so from the colonial period onward, people always commented, and every visitor during the colonial period, the 19th century, even onward would comment on mate. It's a strange drink. Everybody's drinking it, and then sharing it. I've tried really hard, and other people have too, to track down the bombilla. The references are later to the bombilla. There's a wonderful dictionary from very early on that the Jesuits made, Guarani Spanish. There's a lot of references to mate. They talk about the recipient for drinking mate, but that's the same word for drinking wine. So that's the gourd or a ceramic vessel, but there's no reference to the bombilla, which could easily have been made from taquara or bamboo, and it wouldn't. Archaeologists would have a hard time tracking it down. So I really think that the bombilla is indigenous, but we don't have proof. And everybody who traveled, they would always comment on people drinking it, and that first of all, if you're going around in the countryside, if you're coming to this region, you have to try it. Like you're just forced to, you just have to try it. And that most people, after a time, they start to enjoy it. So really, it was even into throughout the 19th century, it was a way of like going native, like you're adopting it, you're becoming part of the culture.
I was fascinated by your argument about that immigrants performed their Argentine identity through adopting mate at the turn of the 20th century, when there was popular blowback from the massive wave of immigration, which was double the percentage-wise that of the United States. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so it's fascinating. Especially in this 19th century, we see a transition. At the beginning of the 19th century, everybody is drinking mate. Rich, poor, whatever race, whatever gender, everybody is drinking it. You see elite tertulias or dances, social gatherings, the elite are drinking mates, but then it disappears. So there's a lot of people who have written about the reflecting over the 19th century from the time period. They say in the beginning of the 19th century, everybody's drinking it. By the late 1800s, the elite are no longer drinking it. It becomes clandestine. But on the opposite side, you have immigrants, and they're raising the per capita consumption because they're drinking a lot of mate. And there's a Jewish Argentine, Gerchunov, who writes in a popular magazine about how the native-born Argentines, and especially the elite, they're not drinking so much mate, but it's the immigrants who never can have the bombilla away from their lips, that they're always drinking it. And it was a way to integrate. So I don't know how many of you have gone to foreign countries, but I will always have an accent in when I travel in a Spanish-speaking country. And you always stand out as a foreigner, especially when you don't speak, but you have an accent. And if there's anti-immigrant sentiment, you want to try to integrate, you want to try to be accepted. And drinking mate is the way you could show that you were Argentine. Also, it was also a way that if you drank mate, maybe your religious practices or your cultural practices from your homeland would be more acceptable because you were integrating by drinking mate. That was a way to show that you were drinking mate. So this is a little bit of a later period, but this is a Jewish family drinking mate. Some of the upper middle class Jewish populations stopped drinking mate, or I don't know if they always, was some classism there and not always drinking mate. And here you can see, I don't know if these are immigrants or not, but you can see how, they have they have a little fire in the kettle, and they're passing around the mate, and it's really showing that you're part of the community, and it's a way of social interaction. You're talking while you're drinking mate.
I was intrigued by your argument about mate as an important social articulator and boundary marker. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, so especially during this time period, the late 19th century, early 20th century, the elite, they want to be European. So these are 1903, 1910. So the countryside, I don't have many gaucho pictures here, but this is kind of the gaucho. And the woman, she doesn't have any shoes on. They have a thatched roof. It's quaint. It's nice for a postcard, but that's not what the Buenos Aires Argentine elite aspired to. This was backward. This is holding back the country. On the other hand, these grand boulevards that look like Paris, that's what we aspire to. That's where the civilization is. This goes back to Sarmiento. And mate is not a part of that. And so really we see in the beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century, the Porteño elite, they want to be European. They start drinking tea and coffee. Mate is a clandestine beverage. They drink that no longer in the social gatherings. If they drink it in the bedroom, they drink it in the kitchen. They're not drinking and sharing it publicly. And this continues through the 20th century. And we see this is 2017, which is, if you have extra time and you're bored, to Google and watch, if you speak Spanish, listen to the video of La Cheta del Nordelta. But this is in the New York Times in 2017. And she leaves this voicemail on her realtor's WhatsApp. She is a normal lady, she says, but she's a surgeon and has a weekend home in Nordelta. And she complains about her neighbors who are like beasts with no education, who drink mate as they would at the lower class Bristol Beach in Mar del Plata. She's asking for something to be done or her money to be given back. Like, she can't live with these beasts. This went viral on social media. People were appalled. But even with COVID, there were other instances of people saying, there was a diputado who said, COVID is a great reason to get rid of this horrid practice that's held back our country. It's like, it's a waste of time. Another woman talked about the forget what her term was, the humble people who shared mate. That's why she couldn't get home from Miami, because COVID was spreading because the poor people are sharing mate. So there's still this class distinction.
Can you explain the important role played by German immigrants in 20th century mate cultivation in Misiones and beyond? In particular, because we have a German historian who's now been teaching courses on Germans in Latin America, and who's, I think he's probably on this event, and he'll be interested to know.
Yeah. So Argentina had its Belle Epoque, or its boom, when it was one of the top 10 wealthiest countries in the world between 1880 and 1914. And huge waves of immigrants came. Well, Misiones doesn't really, they try to attract immigrants. They try to have people settle, they try to develop the region, but nothing really happens until 19 teens. 1920s, 19 teens. And that's when cultivation of yerba is figured out. And there are big waves then of European immigrants. Again, there's this effort to have Europeans settle, not mestizos or the local population. And they set up these yerba colonies. And so you can see this European man on the left with his yerba tree. Here's this Colonia Santo Pifo is Swiss immigrants. It's an English advertisement about yerba mate farming is a splendid investment with or without occupation. So either you could work the land yourself or you could invest in it and have somebody plant your yerba mate. And today, the festival of the immigrant in Argentina is in Misiones. And Misiones, if you look at all of the different European ethnicities, is one of the most diverse parts of Argentina. It's largely European ethnicities, but there are a number of still very strong Polish, Ukrainian, German, and Colonia Liebig, which the Playadita yerba that we're drinking is a German cooperative. Today, this is from 2016. The planters still identify as colono, and colono means European colonist. And so the yerbateros, the small farmers, still identify with these European roots. The people who work on the harvesting are much browner, more Guarani, Paraguayan, Brazilian connections.
I'm just trying to piece together what I know about the massive number of Italians who came to Argentina. They arrived mostly in Buenos Aires, and they formed part of the working class that Juan Perón.
Yeah.
But so you're talking about a kind of rural European population. Of what percentage would you say were Germans in this rural?
Significant. I don't know the percentage. When I would look through the censuses of yerba planters, not that many Italian names. I would see some.
Right.
Definitely more European, non-Italian. And they would try to go to Papas first. You want to go into cattle ranching, that's much more lucrative. This is where you go if it's too expensive for you.
Got it. This is a fascinating story about mate, as well as one which changes our periodization of Argentine history. It's often presumed that import substitution, industrialization, and trade protectionism was a feature of the regime of Juan Perón. But we see in your book that the roots of that, economic project lay earlier, as Argentine producers sought to protect from Brazilian mate competition. Also in your account, we see the rise of regulatory boards and thus corporatism starting in the 30s, not the 40s, under Perón. Can you elaborate on how mate chronology changes our view of 20th century Argentine history?
So this is great because Argentina is often always criticized for all their economic problems and that they always have horrible economic policies and the country's a basket case. And what I found is they actually did some really brilliant, I think, economic policies. So if we go back to the late 19th century and into the first decades of the 20th century, Argentina is importing all of its yerba, almost all of its yerba mate, primarily from Brazil and a little bit from Paraguay. And also we think of industrialization is happening around the world. We think of it happening much later in Argentina. But in the 1880s, it starts in 1882, Argentina decides to have high tariffs on processed yerba mate. So that means there are lower taxes on the unprocessed yerba mate and higher taxes on the processed yerba mate, incentivizing all the companies that are harvesting yerba mate in Brazil and Paraguay to put their processing plants, move them to Buenos Aires or Rosario. So they industrialize yerba mate processing really early on. So when we get into the 20th century, they're already importing very little industrialized processed yerba. They're importing most of they're importing huge amounts, but it's the raw material. So they industrialize really early on and force those companies, even if they're based in Paraguay or Brazil, base their industrialization in Argentina. And then we see in the 1930s, there are they need to protect their Argentine yerba. They've cultivated. There's been a big green oro verde, green gold, and there's all these colonists are planting yerba. You have a boom in yerba, and the prices are starting to bottom out, and you have the competition from Brazil. So they're trying to put tariffs on all of the yerba. The colonists are crying for tariffs. But you can't really give tariffs because Brazil is their biggest export to Argentina is yerba mate. And Argentina, they want to sell their wheat to Brazil. They're fearful of a trade war, which was really kind of stupid because they're not going to be importing all their wheat from the United States. It's too far away. But they don't raise the protection on yerba mate. Instead, they do a regulatory board. They raise the taxes on domestic yerba and on imported yerba, but they send back a portion of that to help the Argentine producers. So it's an ingenious way of not taxing the Brazilian yerba more officially, because they tax both of them, but then giving the profits of that back through this regulatory board. And the regulatory board, it was amazing. They functioned through up till the 1980s, and they would make a prediction that there was going to be the prices were going to go up. There was not going to be enough yerba, so they would incentivize people to plant. Then they said, oh no, we're going to have an oversupply, too many people planted. So then they did huge, prevented people from planting by doing big taxes and not allowing people to plant. So there was this big regulation that lasted until the 1980s, but it protected the small producers.
How interesting. Yeah, it's sort of it's very interesting aspect of this that, this is like a really fresh story that I hadn't heard about before. Mate was esteemed as a fuel for labor for centuries. Then socialists flipped this when they disdained it as a time squanderer in the 1930s. How was it that yerba mate workers first were seen as symbols of capitalist exploitation, then they became symbols of European smallholder cultivation, and finally they were cast as white slaves who were exploited horrors of capitalism? And in particular, how did this last image, how was it enabled by the rise of the myth of a white Argentina crafted from European immigrants?
So the socialists are so interesting in this because I would think that they would be, in support of the small farmers. But in fact, their base is in Buenos Aires, and they're the workers, and the workers need cheap yerba. So they are not actually supporting the small farmers because they want to keep the cheap yerba in order to keep the prices down. And also they are elitist porteños they actually, in some of these congressional debates, they said they'd be happy to have yerba mate disappear, that once their population is it can eat well and drink well and provide for themselves, mate is going to disappear because they're going to replace it with tea. That this is for the people who are too poor and hungry. So the socialists have this really interesting relationship with yerba mate cultivation. But there's the communists, the socialists, the anarchists, and then Perón all use the symbol of the yerba worker. And can you move it forward? So I came across these great. The one on the left is the main socialist newspaper, and he also talks about the white slaves. But I can read part of it from here. Latifundio and slavery, horrors of capitalism, etc. Like these really yellow journalism, horrible indictments against the Yerba worker. And that's in 1908. And this is when you still have mostly the wild yerba, only the beginnings of the shift to cultivation. And then we have 1945, where it's all plantations. And Varela talks about, we can see here, also in Argentina, there are white slaves. and he talks about the Yerba workers. He says it's gotten a little bit better because now you have the cultivation, it's closer to the government, policing, but there's still horrible abuses. It's very interesting, this use of race, because both of these authors say straight out, these are not Europeans that are doing the work. Europeans couldn't do this work. They talk about how the laborers are speaking Guarani. They really do are clear about there's mixed race, but yet they use the term white slaves, white slavery freely. We see that throughout these articles. And that's really interesting because there's a big longstanding myth of Argentina being white. A lot of people think, they killed off all the indigenous peoples, that it's a white nation. It's still a very contentious issue or debate if you bring it up with Argentines. So there's this myth of whiteness, but yet these people working in the yerbales, the wild ones or cultivated, are not white. They're mixed race. And so calling them white was a way to draw attention to what was going on. The people who are in Buenos Aires who are educated and consider themselves white would be appalled that there's white slavery. If there's black slavery, it's not so bad, largely in their opinions. Also, this is a way to draw attention to this exotic area. This is very far away. If we look at literature, like Horacio Quiroga wrote during earlier period, and it's this exotic selva, jungle, wild animals, and so calling them white slaves makes this more relatable.
Fantastic. So why was there a decline in mate consumption during the Perón regime?
Yeah. So this is a great image. It's satire. So during Perón, he's the man of the workers. He's the man of the workers. He is not trying to turn workers into being middle class. He wants workers to be workers, but consume like the middle class. So that means he wants workers to have a radio like this gentleman, to have some leisure time, to have vacations, to get a refrigerator. So this is a typical symbol of the middle class, except the middle class would have their family around. Instead, he's alone drinking mate. So this is not the typical actual middle class person or aspiring middle class. He's alone with his mate. So under Perón, he's promoting this middle class consumption, and mate doesn't play a role in it. And it's quite fascinating because if you look at images of Perón and also of his wife Evita, they are very much part of the middle class. They also have very intimate photos of family life with their pets and stuff. You never see them drinking mate. Mm-hmm. I went to the Museo Evita and their library. I said, do you have any pictures of Evita or Perón drinking mate? They dug up one image of Evita before Perón with mate, but there are no more. So that's a huge difference from Menem in the 1980s is clearly elite with his polo gear drinking mate. And he spoke about mate, drinking mate. So you see a big change with Perón. And why was that? It's because of this association with the countryside and the poverty. Middle-class consumers do not want to be either of these scenarios. Poor, the countryside, it's quaint, but you don't want to live like that. And you can see here this associated with not having enough to eat. You can drink mate. It's going to keep you from feeling the hunger so much. Mm-hmm. And we see this is in the 60s, Mafalda, total middle class Argentine. And there are volumes of her cartoons, and you never see her drinking mate. No image of mate. And in this one, she asks her friend if his family drinks mate, and he says, sometimes. Why? And she's like, oh no, I'm just curious. And then he beats her up. She's beat up here. And then he says, why were you asking? And she says, could you imagine an executive at his office drinking mate? Like never. It doesn't mate doesn't give prestige. It's lower class. And he protests. He says, "Well, the president drinks mate." And she says, "Yeah, that supports my case." This series right here, those two did not get published.
Wow.
Yeah.
So your book centers the story of how mate became a cultural symbol of Argentine identity. However, mate, as you aptly demonstrate, is truly a transnational beverage since it's beloved as well in Paraguay, Brazil, Chile, and the Middle East even. And there was a trade war between Argentina and Chile over who owned it some years back. Could you please explain how this drink has become so global?
And I want to apologize that my book is about the nation that I'm talking about. My book is about Argentina. And it is an important practice and symbol of identity in Uruguay, Brazil, southern Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, parts of Chile, Bolivia. But what I strongly believe is the history of mate is very distinct in Argentina. That in Argentina, it had this time period where it was not consumed by the elite. It wasn't publicly consumed by middle class people and such. So that's why I focus on Argentina. I can't do the whole everywhere in the book, but you're right. So this is 1966 newspaper article about drinking mate in, especially in Syria. And by I think it's 1936, Syria is the second largest importer of yerba mate behind Uruguay. Doesn't grow it naturally in Uruguay. You can Google yerba mate Syria fighter. There were two that I was trying to decide between, but it still is being drunk in Syria and by Syrians who are moving to other countries or taking it with them. And these were immigrants who adopted it in Argentina and then took it home with them. It's quite interesting because there were other populations, Italians, Polish and such, that came to Argentina. They didn't bring it home like this. So there's a story to be told. I haven't been able to research that. There, in the early 20th century, there were yerba mate sodas. Some in the United States, they didn't sell, or not for long. There was also efforts to sell yerba mate as a tea, as a cheap substitute for coffee and tea, but that didn't become popular. But we see here Club Mate in Germany. It's a very popular tech party drink in Berlin. Hipsters drink it, often with alcohol. And then Materva is, you can find it in any Cuban supermarket. And it is very nostalgic to pre-revolutionary Cuba. And there's a series of a lot of them are very offensive advertisements from that time period.
Okay, so I have one more question. Sorry, this has gone on a long time, but the book is really good. There's so much in this book. You have to get a copy. So what has given rise to the current surge of mate as a global superfood? Its success paralleling the dramatic surge in demand for products like quinoa and organic bananas and cacao in the organics trade, in which Latin America plays a very, very important role. And what role does Argentina have in the current boomlet?
So Guayaquil, I think probably all of you have seen this and maybe even drunk it. These are all different student newspapers that have actually, and you can see bottles and cans of noticeably of Guayaquil. So it's become really popular, especially in California. And I'm really excited to be presenting here and not in like Western Michigan, where I don't think it's popular yet. But the marketing is really fascinating. It was a startup company, Cal Poly graduates, and they really put their heart and soul into giving samples. And they emphasized health, the environment, but then they had to adapt it also. They made it cold for Americans. What do Americans want? They like it cold, sweetened, flavored, pre-prepared, ready to use. But yet they still have the B Corporation, saving the environment, healthy and energizing. So and now there are other brands that are selling yerba mate too.
I remember seeing a Yerba Mate IPA in San Francisco a few years ago.
Kombucha I've seen too, yeah. So that is, I don't know if there are any questions or.
I mean, we have time for.
There are many Zoom questions as well.
Oh, there are. Wow. Well, then maybe you handle it since you've got this.
Wouldn't spread the first Zoom question.
There are a couple here too.
Well, from Jimena Rodriguez, part Spanish and Portuguese here is the Jimena I'm thinking of. I wonder what you think about the World Health Organization making a statement saying that yerba mate is carcinogenic. It was a big surprise for the South Americans, especially because they never specified if it was the herb itself or the way to drink it in hot water.
Yeah. So I didn't know that the World Health, and I'm taking a note of that. I didn't know that they made a ruling on that, but yeah, there's a lot of, if you Google it, that there's a lot of information about yerba mate being carcinogenic. What Argentines have told me is that it's the hot water that when you serve it over like boiling water and you're sipping through the bombilla, it's the really burning water is what causes the throat cancer. And so Argentine, if you see on any of the packaging, it always has the temperature. And I remember many times in Paraguay, sitting in the countryside and you have the kettle right next to the fire and you just keep refilling it and it's boiling and it's really hot. So maybe that's the case. I'm not sure.
There's a couple of questions.
Question from the room? Yeah.
Bernard?
Hi, thank you for that fascinating talk. I'd just like to maybe share a little something. I'm a historian and musicologist, and I work on music and politics in Nicaragua in the 20th century. And there is a traditional marimba piece called Mate Amargo, operative, that I wondered for until recently how that piece got its name. And it turns out that it has to do with the global circulation of sound recording and sheet music in the 19-teens and 1920s. Mate Amargo was a very popular tune, both instrumentally and set to text, that the Victor Recording Company recorded 8 times between 1915 and 1934. And it may have had other recordings and other lives, but that global circulation is very interesting in terms of, I guess, cultural vestiges.
Interesting. Thanks for sharing.
Sure. Thank you.
Yeah. Right. Go ahead.
Yes, could you talk a little bit about any nutritional aspects, any vitamins?
So I'm not sure. That's not my specialty. And it's hard to figure out what is real and what isn't. Yerba mate has gotten a reputation as a superfood, largely off the what some call nutritional primitivism. And so there's a lot of talk about all of the energizing and health benefits and tying that back to its South American indigenous roots, and therefore it's healthy because of those rather than scientific studies. So there are it's caffeine. Like that, the way I look at it is it's caffeine. So it has those energizing traits of caffeine. As far as health benefits, I'm not sure. I think that's also debatable as far as caffeine.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I couldn't answer it better.
Julia, I wanted to add one thing on the WHO. There is now, so yerba smoked typically for 24 hours. So it goes in direct flame for like 10 seconds and then it goes into a smokehouse for like 24 hours. So there is now a brand on Amazon available that's from Argentina. It's like Eco Teas. I'm sure you've seen it. And that's unsmoked yerba. So I guess some of the carcinogenic concern is the smoking process. So
Although the smoked yerba is my favorite.
well, I know in Paraguay, they take the charcoal right out of the fire and sometimes put it right in the yerba to make cocido. So that's
Yeah.
even directly more carcinogenic there.
Thanks, Doc.
Yeah.
Do we have time for some
Yes, yeah, but, so actually, before we go any further, the Latin American Institute's two fine publicity interns are going to be passing around, are you already passing around?
They're coming around.
Okay, we have coming around. So these events and many other events are in part funded by funding from the U.S. Department of Education that asks us to evaluate the impact our events are having. So we have a brief survey that if you have time, we would appreciate you filling out by scanning the QR code on there. And for those of you who are watching via Zoom, I'm putting a link in the chat in just a moment. Our next question comes from Jonathan Mulkey, a graduate student at UC Davis. He says, hello, Julia. My name is Jonathan. I'm from Argentina. I'm writing my thesis on representations of yerba mate in Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil at UC Davis. My question is about yerba mate in Brazil. Unlike Argentina and Paraguay, where mate has become a national emblem, it appears that the chimarrão has not achieved the same level of national symbolism and remains largely confined to southern Brazil. Would you agree with this observation, and what factors do you believe have contributed to the situation? And then I would also add on to the end of that, the other place where mate is like a huge part of national identity is Uruguay too.
Mhm.
And in what ways has, I know you didn't study Uruguay for the book, right? But
Yeah.
from what you've heard, at least anecdotally, how does the place that mate has in Uruguay a national identity similar to or different from in Argentina?
Yeah, so,
So Brazil and Uruguay.
first of all, Jonathan, get in touch with me and anybody who's interested in talking more with me about yerba mate or sharing any experiences or thoughts. Just look for my email, my webpage at ASU and send me an email because I love to talk about this and hear what people's doing. So, yeah, there hasn't been a lot done about yerba mate in Brazil in the colonial period. And some of the yerbales really bordered on Portuguese territory. And how much was Brazil involved in that? I haven't really, our Portuguese territory, I haven't really researched that. And I think that there's more to be done with that. And so I think that the longer trajectory of yerba mate in Brazil can explain probably why it's not drunk outside of southern Brazil. And anecdotally, when I talk to Brazilians, if they're not from southern Brazil, they're like, that's nasty. So that's, but except in Rio with Mate Leão.
Well, except also there is one of the most popular like Brazilian sort of like fast food type joints is Hey do Mate, right? Which is the sort of like the mate stand you have in all the shopping malls and stuff.
Is it?
It's heavily sweetened. It's not like
Yeah.
served in the chimarrão. It's probably more to the American palate, I suppose.
And that what's very interesting was right before Brazil got the Olympics, they tried to clean up the beach in Rio. And so they made lots of restrictions against the ambulatory vendors. And the ambulatory vendors, one of the big things that they sold was iced Mate Leão. And there was a big uproar by the citizens of Rio. And eventually they had to allow the ambulatory vendors back. And they actually named the ambulatory vendors cultural patrimony, Carioca Beach cultural patrimony. It's not the mate, and it's iced and it's heavily sweetened, iced tea. It's not the mate, it's the ambulatory vendors. They sell some other things than mate, but they always wear the Mate Leão shirt. They have to wear that as that's part of their identity. And Mate Leão is now owned by Coca-Cola. And they tried to sell it in Asia, not too successfully. Anything else?
Time for another question from the.
I think we do. Another question from Jimena Rodriguez. Could you delve a little deeper into the paradox that you observed between the number of coffee shops in Argentina and the fact they do not serve mate in them? What are your thoughts about this?
So largely it's because there's no profit. So now they will sell you water for your thermos. So you bring your thermos, you get refilled. But when you drink mate, you don't always eat when you drink mate, and you share one mate gourd and one thermos. So you're going to sit there and take up a lot of space, and it's not profitable. So there are a couple places where you can get more of the mate cocido, the tea, but mate is generally not sold. When I was doing my research, there was a Starbucks nearby, and we had there was an electrical outage for like a week, and the whole several blocks of Buenos Aires had no electricity. And I remember walking by the Starbucks, and the employees were sitting in the back and they're drinking their mate. But you don't usually see the mate. The other thing that's interesting is I've always been curious why Uruguayans have the higher per capita consumption of yerba mate than Paraguayans. I understand with Argentines, not all Argentines drink it, and they tend to drink, in my experience, less of the mate than do Paraguayans. It's because Uruguay has more of a history of individual mates than the shared. You'll have a lot more Paraguayans sharing one mate. And so that would reduce the per capita consumption.
So interesting.